30 men stepped off a Qantas charter flight in Saigon on August 3, 1962. They wore civilian clothes. They carried no unit flag. They had no press corps trailing behind them, no brass band, no ceremony whatsoever. The entire United States Military Assistance Command Vietnam, a sprawling apparatus of 11,000 American advisors spread across South Vietnam, barely noticed their arrival. A clerk logged their names, a liaison officer assigned them billets, and within 72 hours, these 30 Australians had scattered across the country in pairs, disappearing into provinces so remote that American advisors refused postings there. They were warrant officers and captains, most of them old enough to be fathers of the young American conscripts flooding into the country. Their average age was 35. Their average combat experience stretched back through 3 wars, and their commanding officer, a quiet, intense colonel named Ted Sarong, had just been handed a mission so absurdly ambitious that the Americans who heard about it assumed it was a joke. Train the entire South Vietnamese military in jungle warfare, with 30 men. No helicopters, no artillery support, no air cover, no supply chain beyond what they could carry or scrounge. Just 30 Australians walking into the most dangerous war on Earth with nothing but expertise that the United States Secretary of State had already admitted his own military did not possess. And you know what happened? Within 18 months, those 30 men were producing results so embarrassing to American operations that General William Westmoreland himself would confront Australian leadership with a question that revealed everything wrong with how America was fighting this war. He looked at what these Australians were doing with Vietnamese soldiers, at the kill ratios, at the intelligence they were generating, at the loyalty they were building among Montagnard tribesmen in the Central Highlands, and he asked a question dripping with barely concealed fury. Why are they soldiers? What he meant was something far more dangerous. Why are Australian warrant officers accomplishing what American battalions cannot? Why is a captain from Queensland running a private army of 1,200 tribal warriors that the Viet Cong cannot penetrate? Why are these men operating alone or in pairs without any of the firepower or technology or logistical superiority that American doctrine considered essential? Why are they winning? And why, God help him, could he not make them stop? Stay with me. To understand why 30 Australians shook the foundations of American military strategy in Vietnam, you have to understand what they carried with them that no amount of American money or firepower could replicate. They carried Malaya. The Malayan emergency had ended just 2 years before the first AATTV advisors touched down in Saigon. For 12 years, from 1948 to 1960, British and Commonwealth forces had fought a communist insurgency in the jungles of the Malay Peninsula. The insurgents used the same tactics the Viet Cong would later employ. They hid among the civilian population. They operated from deep jungle bases. They used terror and political indoctrination to control villages. They were patient, disciplined, and willing to absorb losses that would have broken conventional armies. The British and Australians did not defeat this insurgency with carpet bombing. They did not defeat it with search and destroy operations. They did not defeat it by measuring success in body counts. They defeated it by living in the jungle, by earning the trust of local populations, by training indigenous forces to defend their own villages, and by applying a patience so extreme that American military observers who visited Malaya described it as pathological. The officers and warrant officers who formed the AATTV had absorbed these lessons not from textbooks, but from years of operational experience. They had served in Malaya. Some had fought in Korea before that. A few carried scars from the Second World War, from New Guinea, from the Burma campaign, from the desperate fighting along the Kokoda Track, where Australians had learned that jungle warfare demanded something fundamentally different from the mechanized slaughter of Europe. Colonel Ted Sarong embodied this tradition more completely than any man alive. From 1955 to 1957, he had commanded the Jungle Training Center at Canungra in Queensland, the institution that had forged Australian jungle warfare doctrine since 1942. Canungra was not a school in any conventional sense. It was a crucible. Nestled in the rainforest-draped hills of southeast Queensland, the center occupied over 6,000 hectares of terrain deliberately chosen to replicate the conditions of tropical combat. Soldiers who passed through its courses emerged transformed, conditioned to operate in environments where visibility rarely exceeded a few meters, where every step could trigger a booby trap, where the enemy could be standing 3 meters away and remain invisible. At its peak during the Vietnam era, Canungra processed 10,000 soldiers per year through courses that combined 3 weeks of physical and mental hardening with live fire exercises, obstacle courses, and battle inoculation ranges that pushed men to the absolute limits of human endurance. Those who passed went to Vietnam. Those who failed were reassigned. There was no middle ground. Under Sarong's command, Canungra had attracted instructors of extraordinary caliber. Lieutenant Colonel George Wharf, who had won a military cross in New Guinea and a Distinguished Service Order in Borneo, served as chief instructor. These were men who had fought in jungles against the Japanese, against communist insurgents in Malaya, against Indonesian forces in Borneo. They taught not from textbooks, but from scar tissue, and the lessons they imparted carried the weight of survival earned through years of operational experience. Sarong had taken Canungra's lessons and refined them further during 2 years as strategic advisor to the Burmese Army from 1960 to 1962, training their forces against communist insurgents in terrain remarkably similar to what he would encounter in Vietnam. He had made 2 self-funded reconnaissance visits to South Vietnam in May 1962 before accepting the AATTV command, and what he observed alarmed him profoundly. He recorded in his personal notes that the situation was worse than he had been told, and worsening. Strategic policy was passive and reactionary. The American commander, General Paul Harkins, had not grasped the nature of his task. By the time the CIA station chief in Rangoon recommended Sarong for the Vietnam assignment, he was arguably the most experienced counterinsurgency practitioner in the Western world. The Americans certainly thought so. Sarong would serve not only as AATTV commander, but as senior counterinsurgency advisor to the commander of MACV himself, advising first Harkins and then Westmoreland on matters that the American military establishment was structurally incapable of understanding. When U.S. Secretary of State Dean Rusk met with Australian officials in Canberra in May 1962, he made an admission that should have changed the course of the entire war. The United States Armed Forces, Rusk conceded, knew little about jungle warfare. Australia's expertise from Malaya was precisely what the situation in South Vietnam demanded. This admission should have led to a fundamental rethinking of American strategy. Instead, it produced a request for 30 instructors, 30 men to fix a war that 500,000 Americans would eventually fail to win. The absurdity was not lost on Sarong, but he understood something the Americans did not. 30 of the right men, placed in the right positions, could accomplish more than 30,000 of the wrong ones. The AATTV arrived in Vietnam under the umbrella of the existing American advisory system, technically subordinate to Military Assistance Command Vietnam. Sarong established his headquarters in Saigon and immediately began dispersing his men across the country. 3 groups went north to the provinces around Hue, training Army of the Republic of Vietnam soldiers at the National Training Center at Dong Da and regional forces at Hiep Can. A 4th group deployed to the Ranger Training Center at Duc Mai near Nha Trang. The methodology they brought was alien to everything the Americans were teaching. American advisors trained Vietnamese soldiers in the American way: large unit operations, helicopter mobility, massive firepower, radio coordination. The assumption underlying every lesson was that technology and weight of metal would overcome the enemy's advantages in terrain and motivation. Australian advisors trained Vietnamese soldiers in the Australian way: small patrols, silent movement, individual marksmanship, initiative at the lowest level. The assumption underlying every lesson was that the soldier who understood his environment and could think independently would survive, while the soldier who depended on external support would die the moment that support was unavailable. The difference showed immediately. Vietnamese units trained by Australian advisors began conducting patrols that American-trained units considered impossible. They moved at night. They set ambushes that required hours of motionless waiting. They developed intelligence networks based on personal relationships with village leaders rather than signals, intercepts from expensive electronic equipment. The results were quiet but undeniable. In provinces where Australian advisors operated, Viet Cong activity declined. Not dramatically at first, not in ways that showed up on the statistical charts that MACV headquarters used to measure progress, but steadily, persistently, in ways that the villagers who lived in those provinces understood even if the generals in Saigon did not. The initial restriction on AATTV members was that they could train but not fight. This rule proved immediately impractical. Australian advisors accompanied their Vietnamese students on operations as observers, and when those operations encountered the enemy, the distinction between observer and combatant dissolved in the first burst of gunfire. By late 1963, Sarong had begun quietly redeploying his men into combat advisory roles, placing officers and warrant officers with special forces teams conducting counterinsurgency operations in the most dangerous provinces. This decision, made without explicit authorization from Canberra and only retrospectively approved by the Chief of the General Staff, Lieutenant General John Wilton, marked the first involvement of Australian personnel in actual combat during the Vietnam War. It also marked the beginning of something that would terrify the American command structure far more than the Viet Cong ever did. Australian advisors were not simply training Vietnamese soldiers, they were transforming them. And in one case, in the Central Highlands, a single Australian captain was building something that resembled a private army. Captain Barry Peterson arrived in Vietnam in 1963 as an AATTV member with experience training indigenous forces in Malaya. The CIA, recognizing his particular talents, seconded him to a classified program in Darlak Province, deep in the Central Highlands. His mission was to recruit, train, and lead Montagnard tribesmen in guerrilla operations against the Viet Cong. The Montagnards were the indigenous hill tribes of Vietnam, despised by both North and South Vietnamese governments, pushed to the margins of their own homeland, and caught in a war they had not asked for. Previous attempts by American Special Forces to organize Montagnard militias through the Civilian Irregular Defense Group program had produced mixed results. The Americans rotated in and out on short tours. They struggled with language barriers. They maintained a professional distance that the Montagnards interpreted as disrespect. Peterson did none of these things. He moved into a Montagnard village. He learned the Rod language. He ate their food. He participated in their ceremonies. He accepted their customs without attempting to impose Western values. He treated them, in short, exactly the way his Malayan emergency training had taught him to treat indigenous populations, not as instruments of policy, but as people whose cooperation had to be earned through trust and mutual respect. The results were staggering. Within months, Peterson had recruited a force of several hundred men. By 1964, his force had grown large enough to conduct sustained operations, and in September of that year, a crisis erupted that would test both Peterson's leadership and his loyalty. A large-scale Montagnard revolt broke out across the Central Highlands, tribal fighters rising up against the South Vietnamese government that had treated them as subhuman for generations. Peterson found himself caught between his CIA handlers, his Australian chain of command, the furious South Vietnamese government, and the Montagnard leaders who trusted him above all others. Under conditions of extreme personal risk, he approached the rebel leaders and negotiated between them and district officials, diffusing a situation that could have shattered the entire Allied effort in the Highlands. For this action, he was awarded the Military Cross for distinguished courage. But the revolt had drawn attention to something that made powerful men deeply uncomfortable. A junior Australian captain had become so central to the stability of an entire region that his removal could have triggered a military catastrophe. By 1965, his Truong Son force, the Tigermen, numbered 1,200 warriors, funded by the CIA with an operational budget of 5 million Vietnamese piastres, equipped with weapons from American warehouses, and fiercely loyal to the Australian captain who had earned their trust by living as they lived. The Montagnards named the force's base Dam San after Peterson, using the raid name for a legendary warrior who was victorious in all battles and who could not be conquered except by the spirit of the sun. It was a title that carried the weight of 40,000 years of tribal memory, and they gave it to a captain from Queensland who had earned it by doing what no American advisor had managed. He had become one of them. The Tigermen did not simply defend their villages. They conducted offensive operations along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, disrupting supply lines, staging ambushes, kidnapping Viet Cong agents, and gathering intelligence that American units with 10 times the resources could not obtain. They ran an agent network and propaganda teams. They operated with a tactical flexibility that formal military units could not match because they knew the terrain the way a farmer knows his own fields, every trail, every water source, every hiding place. And this was where the trouble began. Peterson's success created enemies on every side. The South Vietnamese government viewed any Australian with too much influence over ethnic minorities as a potential threat to national unity. American senior officers asked an uncomfortable question that Ambassador Maxwell Taylor articulated directly. Why is an Australian doing this work? Why not an American? The CIA, which had initially given Peterson remarkable autonomy, began to grow suspicious. They accused him of developing a personality cult. They feared he had gone native, a term that carried echoes of Joseph Conrad and foreshadowed the Colonel Kurtz character that Francis Ford Coppola would later make famous. The parallels were so striking that many Vietnam historians believe Peterson's story directly inspired elements of Apocalypse Now. The final break came when the CIA asked Peterson to incorporate his Tigermen into the Phoenix program, a campaign that targeted suspected Viet Cong political operatives for assassination. Peterson refused. He was a trained Army officer. His men were volunteers who had signed up to defend their villages, not to serve as executioners in a campaign that routinely killed civilians on the basis of unverified intelligence. This refusal sealed his fate. The CIA wanted him out. Peterson left the Central Highlands in late 1965, departing through a series of farewell ceremonies at Montagnard longhouses that included animal sacrifices and rice wine. The tribesmen who had followed him into battle wept. He later learned that had he refused to leave, arrangements had been made to have him killed. His replacement, an American CIA employee, failed to gain the trust of the Montagnards. The Tigermen program collapsed. The intelligence networks dried up. The Viet Cong reclaimed territory that Peterson's forces had denied them for 2 years. The destruction of the Tigermen program illustrated a pattern that would repeat throughout the war. Australian methods worked. They worked so well that they threatened the institutional assumptions upon which American strategy depended. And when Australian success became impossible to ignore, the response was not adaptation, but suppression. While Peterson was building his Montagnard army in the Highlands, the AATTV was expanding across the length of South Vietnam. By 1965, the team had grown to approximately 100 members, now including staff sergeants and sergeants alongside the original officers and warrant officers. They served from the Mekong Delta in the far south to the demilitarized zone in the north, a geographic spread that gave Australia something no other allied nation possessed: an independent assessment of the war from one end of the country to the other. This geographic dispersion was not accidental, it was strategic. While the first Australian task force, established in Phuoc Tuy Province in 1966, represented the concentrated Australian combat force that most histories focus on, the AATTV's scattered advisors provided Canberra with ground truth intelligence that contradicted the optimistic assessments flowing from MACV headquarters. AATTV members saw what the big unit war was actually accomplishing at the village level, and what they saw was frequently nothing. For the individual AATTV advisor, this dispersion meant something far more personal. It meant isolation on a scale that most soldiers never experience. An Australian warrant officer posted to a Special Forces camp in the Central Highlands or a Vietnamese infantry battalion near the DMZ might be the only Australian within 100 kilometers. He ate Vietnamese food. He slept in Vietnamese quarters. He fought alongside Vietnamese soldiers whose language he had learned through necessity rather than instruction. When contact with the enemy came, and it came often, he had no Australian unit to fall back upon, no familiar chain of command to invoke, no guarantee that the soldiers beside him would hold their positions or follow his advice. The combat that AATTV members experienced was frequently more intense than anything the main Australian task force encountered in Phuoc Tuy. Operating in the northern provinces, in the Central Highlands, along the DMZ, these advisors fought in some of the hottest zones of the entire war. They accompanied ARVN units on operations that American advisors avoided. They led Montagnard Mike Force companies into battles against North Vietnamese Army regulars who outnumbered them dramatically. They did this knowing that if things went wrong, extraction might be hours or days away, if it came at all. The AATTV's unique culture produced men of a particular temperament. They were volunteers, every one of them. Many served multiple tours. Some, like Warrant Officer Ray Simpson, accumulated over 60 months of service with the team. They chose this duty, knowing its dangers, knowing its isolation, knowing that the visibility of their sacrifice would be minimal compared to the battalions fighting set-piece battles that made the news. They chose it because the work mattered, because training a Vietnamese soldier to defend his own village was worth more than any number of helicopter assaults into empty jungle. The tension between Australian advisory methods and American operational doctrine crystallized around a fundamental disagreement about what winning looked like. For Westmoreland, winning meant body count. Kill enough Viet Cong, and the enemy would lose the will to fight. Every metric in the American system was designed to measure killing. Commanders were evaluated on kills. Units competed for the highest tallies. The entire analytical apparatus of MACV was oriented toward demonstrating that the rate of enemy attrition exceeded the rate of enemy recruitment. For the Australians, this approach was not merely wrong, it was insane. Body count incentivized exactly the wrong behaviors. It rewarded large, loud operations that generated impressive statistics but accomplished nothing strategically. It punished the patient, quiet work of building relationships with local populations, developing intelligence networks, and training indigenous forces to provide their own security. Worst of all, it measured inputs rather than outcomes. The relevant question was not how many enemy you killed today. The relevant question was whether the village you were supposedly protecting was more secure today than it was yesterday. Westmoreland's frustration with Australian operations boiled over in January 1967 when he visited the 1st Australian Task Force at Nui Dat. After observing Australian operations, he described their approach as very inactive. The criticism was directed at Brigadier Stuart Graham, who responded through official channels with controlled fury. The Australian task force had achieved kill ratios exceeding 10-1. They had sustained the lowest casualty rate of any comparable Allied force. Enemy activity in their area of operations had declined to the point where Viet Cong units were actively avoiding contact, and Westmoreland called this inactive. The accusation revealed the gulf between two military cultures that spoke the same language, but inhabited different strategic universes. Australian inactivity looked like this: continuous patrols across Phuoc Toi Province, day and night, in platoon and section strength, moving silently through terrain that American units would only enter with company-strength formations and helicopter support. SAS reconnaissance teams operating for weeks inside enemy-controlled territory, mapping trail networks, identifying supply caches, and building the intelligence picture that allowed subsequent operations to strike with precision rather than saturation. American activity looked like this: battalion-strength helicopter assaults into suspected enemy areas, accompanied by preparatory artillery bombardments and airstrikes that announced the operation's location to every Viet Cong scout within 20 kilometers. The enemy would withdraw before the Americans arrived, wait for them to leave, and return to the same positions the following week. The statistics generated were impressive. the strategic effect was zero. But the truly devastating comparison, the one that MACV headquarters most desperately wanted to suppress, came from the AATTV advisors operating outside Phu Hoc Tue. These men worked alone or in pairs, embedded with Vietnamese units across the most dangerous provinces in the country. They had no battalions to call upon, no helicopter gunships circling overhead, no artillery on speed dial. They had their training, their experience, their ability to earn the trust of the soldiers they advised, and nothing else. And they were the most highly decorated Australian unit in the entire Vietnam War. 4 Victoria Crosses, the highest award for gallantry in the Commonwealth, awarded to AATTV members during the conflict. No other Australian unit in Vietnam received even one. Warrant Officer Kevin Dasher Wheatley earned his posthumously in November 1965, in circumstances that stripped warfare to its most elemental human core. Wheatley was accompanying a civilian irregular defense group company on a search and destroy operation in the Tra Bong Valley of Quang Ngai Province, deep in enemy-dominated territory, accessible only by small aircraft, landing on a dirt strip. When the company was ambushed and the Vietnamese soldiers broke and fled, Wheatley's companion, Warrant Officer Swanton, was hit and went down with severe wounds. Wheatley was unwounded. He could have withdrawn with the retreating Vietnamese. Every tactical calculation said he should. Instead, he stayed. He dragged Swanton into cover, propped himself against a tree, and fought. When his ammunition ran low, he pulled the pins on his remaining grenades, wrapped his arms around his wounded mate, and waited for the enemy to close. They found both Australians together. Wheatley had chosen to die rather than abandon a fellow soldier. The citation noted that his acts of heroism, determination, and unflinching loyalty would always stand as examples of the true meaning of valor. Major Peter Badco earned his posthumously in 1967, killed leading his third assault in as many months across open ground under devastating fire in Thu Thien Province. Known as the Galloping Major because he was perpetually in motion, Badco had developed a reputation among the Vietnamese soldiers. He advised as a man who would always be at the front, always the first into danger, always willing to do what he asked others to do. On 3 separate occasions between February and April 1967, he led charges against fortified enemy positions, each time exposing himself to fire that should have killed him. The third time, it did. Warrant Officer Ray Simpson earned his in May 1969 for sustained courage across multiple engagements with Mobile Strike Force units in the tri-border area. And Warrant Officer Keith Payne earned his 2 weeks after Simpson on May 24, 1969, when his company of Montagnard soldiers was overrun by a North Vietnamese Army force near Ben Het Camp in the Central Highlands. Payne's action that night captures everything the AATTV represented. His 212th Company, part of the 1st Mobile Strike Force Battalion, was attacked by a force estimated between 1,200 and 3,000 North Vietnamese regulars. When the Montagnard soldiers began to break, Payne exposed himself to direct fire to rally them. A grenade detonated near his position, driving shrapnel into his head, arms, and hands. Bleeding, partially blinded, he organized the remnants of 2 shattered companies into a defensive perimeter. Then, as darkness fell, Payne went back out into the killing ground. For 3 hours, alone, wounded, navigating by sound and instinct through terrain crawling with enemy soldiers, he searched for the men who had scattered during the assault. He found 40 of them. Most were wounded. He carried some. He guided others. He moved through North Vietnamese positions so close he could hear individual soldiers talking, and he brought every one of those 40 men back alive. When asked years later whether he had been afraid, Payne answered with the unadorned honesty that defined the AATTV's culture. "My God, yes, yes, I was." The AATTV served in Vietnam for over 10 years, from August 1962 to December 1972. It was the first Australian unit into the country and the last to leave. A total of 1,009 men served with the team across its decade of operations. 33 were killed. 122 were wounded. They received over 100 decorations for gallantry, a concentration of valor per capita that no other Australian unit has ever matched. They were never more than 227 men at peak strength. They never possessed their own helicopters, their own artillery, their own air support. They operated within a system designed by Americans, for Americans, using American assumptions that contradicted nearly everything the Australians believed about how to fight an insurgency. And they succeeded so consistently and so visibly that their success became a problem. Because if 30 Australians in 1962 could train Vietnamese soldiers to fight effectively with patience, trust, and junglecraft, then what did that say about the tens of thousands of American advisors who could not? If a single captain from Queensland could build a 1,200-man guerrilla force using nothing but personal integrity and cultural respect, then what did that say about the billion-dollar American advisory apparatus that was failing to produce comparable results? If warrant officers earning a fraction of an American colonel's pay could operate alone in the most dangerous provinces in Vietnam and not merely survive, but earn the highest decorations for valor available in their nation's honors system, then what did that say about an American doctrine that insisted no operation was viable without overwhelming superiority in every measurable category? These questions were dangerous. Answering them honestly would have required American military leadership to confront the possibility that their entire strategic framework was wrong, that bigger was not better, that more firepower did not equal more security, that the war could not be won by the methods being employed, regardless of how many resources were committed. Westmoreland never accepted these conclusions. His memoir, A Soldier Reports, published years after the war, praised the Australians as the most thoroughly professional foreign force serving in Vietnam, comparing them favorably to the legendary post-Versailles German army. But this praise was retrospective, calculated, and safe. During the war itself, when the Australian example was a living rebuke to everything MACV was doing, the response was friction, criticism, and institutional resistance. Lieutenant General Julian Ewell, commanding 2nd Field Force Vietnam in 1969, visited Phuoc Toi Province and declared it a disaster because Australian body count statistics did not meet his expectations. The fact that enemy activity had plummeted, that security had improved beyond anything comparable American sectors could demonstrate, that the province was measurably closer to genuine pacification than virtually any other area in South Vietnam. None of this registered against the single metric Ewell cared about. Australians were not killing enough people fast enough. An Australian officer, writing privately about this encounter, captured the strategic divorce in a single sentence that has echoed through military analysis ever since. American generals wanted to win Vietnam by killing every Vietnamese. Australians wanted to win by convincing the Vietnamese that the government side offered better security than the Communist side. These were not compatible strategies. The AATTV's final act came in its last 2 years, as Australian forces prepared to withdraw. The team expanded to its peak strength and established a jungle warfare training center at Nui Dat, modeled on Canongra, designed to transfer Australian expertise to Vietnamese forces who would soon have to fight without Allied support. It was a return to the original mission: training, advisory work, the patient, unglamorous work of building capability rather than destroying enemies. When the last AATTV members departed Saigon on December 18, 1972, they left behind something that no statistical analysis could capture. They left behind proof that there had been another way to fight this war, that patience could outperform aggression, that trust could outperform technology, that 30 men with the right skills and the right philosophy could accomplish what armies of hundreds of thousands could not. The American military would not absorb these lessons for decades, not until Iraq and Afghanistan forced a painful rediscovery of counterinsurgency principles that the Australians had demonstrated in 1962. Not until the creation of advisory teams that looked remarkably similar to the AATTV. Not until senior American officers began citing the Malayan emergency as a model for population-centric warfare, half a century after Australian veterans of that campaign had tried to teach those same lessons in the jungles of Vietnam. The AATTV was renamed in honor when the Australian Army Training Contingent in Iraq was designated the Australian Army Training Team Iraq in 2004. The name was a deliberate tribute, a recognition that the original team had established a template for advisory operations that remained relevant across generations. But for the men who served with the original team, the recognition came late and the costs came early. They had operated in isolation, often without the psychological support structures available to soldiers in conventional units. They had made decisions alone, fought alone, grieved alone. The post-traumatic stress that followed many of them home was compounded by the fact that their war had been invisible, fought in the spaces between the headlines, too quiet and too successful to attract the attention their sacrifice deserved. Keith Payne, the last living Australian recipient of the original Imperial Victoria Cross, spent years after the war battling alcoholism and the nightmares that his service in the Central Highlands had burned into his memory. The same man who had walked wounded through enemy positions to rescue 40 soldiers could not sleep through a single night without reliving what he had seen. He eventually became an advocate for veterans struggling with the same invisible wounds, channeling the same courage that had earned him the Commonwealth's highest honor into a different kind of battle. Peterson retired as a lieutenant colonel, settled in Bangkok, and spent decades working quietly to help Montagnard refugees who had been abandoned when their American and Australian allies departed. He died in 2019, still carrying the weight of promises made to tribesmen who had trusted him with their lives and their future. Sarong, the man who started it all, left the Australian Army in 1968 and remained in Vietnam as a civilian advisor until the very end, departing on one of the last helicopters from the American Embassy on April 29, 1975. He had spent 13 years in a country that consumed his professional life and vindicated everything he believed about counterinsurgency warfare, only to watch that vindication rendered meaningless by strategic decisions made far above his rank. 30 men walked into Saigon in civilian clothes on a commercial flight in August of 1962. They carried no banners, They received no ceremony. They were so few that the American military machine that surrounded them barely registered their existence. And over the next decade, those 30 men and their successors would demonstrate to anyone willing to look that the greatest military power on earth was fighting the wrong war, the wrong way, for the wrong reasons. Westmoreland asked the question, "Why are they soldiers?" The answer was simple. They were soldiers because they understood something Westmoreland never did, that in a war among the people the most powerful weapon is not a bomber or a helicopter or a battalion of paratroopers. The most powerful weapon is a single man who knows the jungle, respects the enemy, earns the trust of the people he is fighting for, and possesses the patience to let that trust do what firepower never could. 30 men, 4 Victoria Crosses, 10 years, 1,000 lives passed through the team's ranks, and a legacy that the institutions which ignored them are still, more than half a century later, struggling to understand.